Hello student friends, this is Professor R.M. Mahendrakar, Department of Botany, JSS Arts, Science and Commerce College, Gokak. So far, we have seen all the different types of climatic factors, edaphic factors and biotic factors. And from this we can conclude that the climate is not uniform throughout the earth. The climate in the equator region is different. In the subtropical level it is different, in the temperate region it is different, and in the polar caps also it is different. The edaphic factor, that is the soil, also differs from one region to another region. Hence, the vegetation also differs. In the equatorial region, the vegetation is totally different from what vegetation we see in the polar caps. So, as the climate varies, as the environment varies, the plant vegetation also varies. It is all because of the adaptations we see in the plants. So, it is the adaptations in the plants that has made it to survive on this planet Earth in these different climatic conditions. We see plants growing inside the water and in water. We see plants growing in harsh desert conditions. We see plants growing in the normal conditions. We see plants growing on another plants. So to suit all these different environmental conditions and to suit its habitat, the plant does modify itself. In other words, it alters its morphological features, its anatomical features and physiological features so it can take the maximum use of the habitat in which it is surviving and thus propagate itself. Thus, every organism develops certain adaptations and so does the populations or a community. The completion of a life cycle of an organism or stabilization of a community results through a series of adaptations which have survivors. On basis of water relations, Warming classified plants into three types: hydrophytes, which are water-loving plants; xerophytes, which survive in those areas where there is poor supply of water; and mesophytes are the plants which grow in neither dry condition nor wet condition. So in today's class, we will be restricting our study only to the first, that is hydrophytes. The word hydrophyte is derived from the Greek word hudor, meaning water, phyton means plant. So thus they are commonly known as water plants. They are also called as aquatic plants. So these plants, in order to survive in such watery conditions, they have modified themselves in morphological features, in anatomical features, and also in their physiology. Hence, that according to their relations to water and air, the hydrophytes are grouped into the following categories. They are submerged hydrophytes, these are the plants which remain always submerged inside the water. Free-floating hydrophytes, these are the hydrophytes which float on the water surfaces. And the amphibious plant, these are the plants which need both water and land. The first type are these submerged hydrophytes. These plants grow below the water surface and are not in contact with the atmosphere. Such plants may be free-floating or rooted. For example, the plant like this Potamogeton alpinus, the plant remains rooted at the bottom of the pond, river or lake, and the plant remains submerged inside the water. So also is this water fern, and this water fern is commonly used in fish aquarium. The another most common is this Vallisnera. It is found in rivers. The plant is rooted and it is submerged. Now this Hydrilla plant, now here these are the plants which may be rooted or may remain floating inside the water. Even if you just cut a stem of this Hydrilla and throw it in the water, it propagates. So is the case with this Najas. Najas indica also is the most common aquarium plant. It can be grown in both forms, that is, it may remain freely floating inside the water or it may remain rooted at the base of the pond, rivers or lakes. The second type are these floating hydrophytes. The plants that float on the surface or slightly below the surface of water are called floating hydrophytes. These plants are in contact with water and air. They may or may not be rooted in the soil. On this ground, the floating plants are divided into two types: the free floating hydrophytes and rooted and floating hydrophytes. The free floating hydrophytes float freely on the surface of water but are not rooted in the mud. Example is this Eichhornia, whose image is towards the left side. Then we have this Wolffia microscopica. It is a rootless minute duckweed. The other examples are this Trappa, then Limnanthemum. All these are some of the examples. Now the second are these rooted and floating hydrophytes. The rooted and floating hydrophytes, here some part of the plant body are rooted in the mud substratum of the pond, rivers and lake, but their leaves and flower shoots float on the surface of water. They are grouped as floating but rooted hydrophytes. Example of this is this Lotus and this Victoria regia. Now in this plant you see that the roots are deep inside. So in this type we see that the roots are embedded at the bottom of the lake or the pond in which it is growing, and the length of the petiole depends upon the depth of the water, and the petioles are very long so that they can bring the leaf surface on top of the water surface. So here you can see in both these images the leaves are floating on the water. Even the flower peduncle also, its length depends upon the depth of the water, so that the flower comes above the water surface and blooms. The third type are these amphibious hydrophytes. These plants are adapted to both aquatic and terrestrial mode of life. Amphibious plants grow either in shallow water or on muddy substratum. The aerial parts of these amphibious plants show mesophytic characters, while the submerged part develop hydrophytic characters. Example is this Marshy, it is a pteridophyte, then this Sagittaria, Jussiaea and Comellini. Amphibious plants which grow in saline marshy places are termed as halophytes. These are commonly seen in the delta regions where the river meets the sea. And the most common example of these halophytes growing in this, means the amphibious halophytes. Examples are this rhizophora. Bring the plant body is this Avicennia. Now here you can see whatever the roots you are seeing here, these are the nematophores. Here the plant remains submerged inside the water and the roots need aeration. So this is one of the adaptation it has done. It has developed nematophores, and these roots, they grow against the gravity, come above the surface of the water and help in exchange of gases. Another example of this halophyte is this Candelia candle. In some amphibious plants, the roots are completely exposed to the air as many land plants, but the roots are buried and lodged in the mud. These are called marshy plants. The most common examples of marshy plants are this cypress, typha, rumex, etc. Now we shall just see the different adaptations done by these hydrophytes to suit their watery environment. Now first let us see the morphological adaptations. In morphological adaptations, we will see the adaptations in root system, adaptations in stem system, and also in the leaves. Root system. The roots in hydrophytes are poorly developed. This is because the plant is always in contact with water, so the water and minerals are directly absorbed through the general body surface. Hence, in most of these hydrophytes, especially the submerged hydrophytes and the free-floating hydrophytes, roots are poorly developed. And even if they are present, they do not show presence of root hairs. Root hairs are absent in most of these hydrophytes. In this plant, Jussiaea repens, two types of roots develop. When the plant grows on the surface of water, some of them are floating roots. These are negatively geotropic roots and they become spongy in structure. And these spongy roots are called as floating roots, as you can see in this image here. And these spongy roots actually help the plant to float on the surface of water. The roots in floating plants do not possess true root cap. True root cap is absent. But very often they develop root pockets or root sheath which protect their tips from injuries. Exact function of these root pockets, however, is not fully understood. Some rooted hydrophytes like this Vallisnera, Elodia, though they derive their nourishment from the water by their body surface, are partly dependent on their roots for minerals from the soil. So the rooted and submerged hydrophytes, the rooted and free-floating hydrophytes, and the amphibious plants, in these plants we can see certain importance of root. In hydrophytes, the stem is very delicate and green or yellow in color. In some cases, it is modified into rhizome or runner or offset. Leaves. In floating plants, leaves are generally peltate, long, circular, light or dark green in color, thin and very smooth. The upper surface are exposed in the air, but the lower surface are generally in touch with water. In Lotus, the petioles of the leaves show indefinite power of growth and keep the lamina of the leaves always on the surface of water, as you can see it in the image. In some aquatic plants develop two types of leaves. This phenomenon is termed as heterophyly. Example for heterophyly are this: Sagittaria, Sagittarifolia, Ranunculus, Equatelis, Limnophilia, Heterophylla, etc. In this phenomenon, generally the submerged leaves are linear, ribbon-shaped or highly dissected, and the leaves that are found floating on or above the water are broad, circular or slightly lobed. The occurrence of heterophyly is probably associated with the physiological behavior of these aquatic plants. For example, it helps in quantitative reduction in transpiration. The broad leaves on the surface overshadow the submerged dissected leaves of the same plant. Thus, they reduce the intensity of the light falling on the submerged leaves because submerged leaves require low intensity of light. Plants show very little response to drought because the necessity of excess water during the drought period is compensated by the submerged leaves, which act as water absorbing organs. The broad leaves found on the surface of the water transpire actively and regulate the hydrostatic pressure in the plant body. That is why we see this type of adaptation, that is the heterophyly phenomenon, in some of these hydrophytes. The leaves of free-floating hydrophytes are smooth, shiny, and frequently coated with wax. The wax coat protects the leaves from chemicals and physical injury and also prevents the water clogging on stomata. In floating plants of water hyacinth, the petioles generally become swollen and develop sponginess, and thus it provides buoyancy for the plant to float on water. Now we shall see the anatomical modifications. The anatomical modification hydrophytes are aimed mainly at reduction in protection structures, increase in aeration, reduction of support or mechanical tissue, and reduction of vascular tissues. First, reduction in protecting structures. The cuticle is totally absent in the submerged part of the plant. It may be present in form of a very fine film on the surface of the plant which is exposed to the atmosphere. The epidermis in hydrophyte is not protecting layer, but it absorbs water, minerals and gases directly from the aquatic environment. Extremely thin cellulose wall of epidermal cells facilitate the absorption process. Epidermal cells contain chloroplast, thus they can function as photosynthetic tissue. Hypodermis in hydrophyte is poorly developed. Its cells are extremely thin-walled. Increase in aeration. The stomatas are totally absent in the submerged part of the plant. In some exceptional cases, vestigial and functionless stomatas may be noticed. In these cases, exchange of gases takes place directly through the cell wall. In floating leaves, stomata develop in very limited number and are confined only on the upper surface of water. In amphibious plant, the stomata remain scattered in both upper and lower epidermis. Parenchyma in submerged leaves and stem is very much developed. Air chambers are filled with respiratory gases and moisture. These cavities are separated from one another by 1 or 2 cell thick collenchymatous partitions. Carbon dioxide present in the air chamber is used in photosynthesis, and the oxygen produced in the process of photosynthesis, which is stored in these air chambers, is used for respiration by the plant. Thus, the air cavities in the parenchyma tissue act as the reservoir of gases. The parenchyma tissue also provides buoyancy and mechanical support to the aquatic plants. Reduction in mechanical tissues. The mechanical tissues are absent or poorly developed in floating and submerged part of the plant because buoyant nature of the water saves them from physical injuries. The thick-walled sclerenchymatous tissue is totally absent in submerged and floating hydrophytes. They may, however, develop in the cortex certain star-shaped lignified cells called astrosclerides, which give mechanical support to the plant. The reduction of absorbing tissue fourth important anatomical feature is reduction of vascular tissue. Generally, the conducting tissue is very poorly developed because the absorption of water and nutrients take place through the entire surface of the submerged plant. There is little need of vascular tissue in these plants. In vascular tissues, the xylem shows the greatest reduction. In some cases, it consists only of a few tracheids, while in some, the xylem elements are not at all developed. Some aquatic plants, however, show a lacuna in the center in the place of xylem. Such spaces resemble the air chambers. Phloem tissue is also poorly developed in most of the aquatic plants, but in some cases, it may be fairly well developed. Sea tubes of aquatic plants are smaller than those of the mesophyte. Phloem parenchyma is extensively developed. Endodermis may or may not be clearly defined. The vascular bundles are generally aggregated towards the center. Now, let us compare the different types of the anatomical and morphological features in the three forms of the hydrophytes, that is the submerged hydrophytes, free-floating hydrophytes and amphibious plants. In submerged hydrophytes, the whole plant body is in contact with water, while the free-floating hydrophyte, some part of the plant is inside the water and some part is above the water. And in amphibious plants, they grow both in water and land. The leaves take carbon dioxide and oxygen from the water in submerged hydrophytes. Whereas in free-floating hydrophytes, leaves take carbon dioxide and oxygen from water and air. And in amphibious plants, the leaves take carbon dioxide and oxygen from air. Heterophyly is absent in submerged hydrophyte. It is seen in some cases of free-floating hydrophytes, and in heterophyly is very common in amphibious hydrophytes. The leaves are reduced and stomata are rudimentary in submerged hydrophytes. In free-floating hydrophytes, the leaves are entire, stomata are found on the upper epidermis only. Leaves show mesophytic characters in case of amphibious hydrophytes. The cuticle suberin layer is totally absent in submerged hydrophyte. Epidermis is coated by a waxy layer in case of the free-floating hydrophyte, that too the part that is exposed to the air. And in amphibious plant, the exposed plant body shows presence of cuticle. Palisade and spongy parenchyma not well differentiated in submerged hydrophyte. In free-floating hydrophyte, palisade is less developed and spongy tissue is well developed with parenchyma tissue. In amphibious plant, the palisade and spongy parenchyma are very well developed. In submerged hydrophyte, the stem is slender and much reduced. While in free-floating hydrophyte, the stem is developed and spongy and provide buoyancy for the plant to float on the surface. And in amphibious plant, the stem is extensively developed with vascular tissue. The roots are greatly reduced in submerged hydrophytes. In free-floating hydrophytes, roots are fibrous with root pockets, and in amphibious hydrophytes, the root is very well developed. In submerged hydrophytes, the parenchyma tissue is very well developed and the air cavities separate with cross septa. In free-floating hydrophyte, parenchyma is developed in abundance with large air cavities. And in amphibious plants, the outer cortex is parenchymatous with large air spaces, and the cortex and the pith are formed by thick-walled cells. So my dear students, here we conclude this topic on the adaptations in hydrophytes. Here we have seen the different types of hydrophytes, we have seen the different morphological adaptations, we have seen the different anatomical adaptations, and also we have done a comparison between all the three forms of hydrophytes. So thank you very much. Please take care of your health and be safe.